Dean at the Woodrow Wilson School. I am just here to give a very brief welcome. Is it on now? Can you hear? Okay. I just want to give you a very brief welcome. This is one of our up-to-the-minute events. We've been trying to carve out time in our public affairs programming to have events that are pulled together very quickly but are on issues that are of great interest to students and faculty and members of the community. I would like to introduce Hal Fivesen, who's going to introduce the panelists and kick this off. Hal, as many of you know, is a longtime researcher at Princeton University. He is at the program in Science and Global Security and a very well-respected person in this area of research. So I'd like to welcome him. Thanks. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Chris. You know, quite apart from the nuclear issue, the overwhelming tragedy in Japan so far has, of course, been the earthquake and the tsunami and the great loss of lives and disruption they've caused. But the nuclear events at the Fukushima site raised their own perils, and it's those events that will be the focus of the panel discussion. Our panelists, in the order that they're going to present, are Eric Van Mark. Eric's professor of civil and environmental engineering at Princeton. He's affiliated with the Princeton Environmental Institute. He taught for several years in MIT's summer course on nuclear plant safety. He served as a consultant on seismic safety issues for the International Atomic Energy Agency and is a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences in his native Belgium. Alexander Glasser is assistant professor at the Woodrow Wilson School and Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Princeton. He's a participant in the university's program on science and global security and a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. M.V. Ramana is currently a member of the program in science and global security, working on the future of nuclear energy in the context of climate change and nuclear disarmament. He's completing a book on nuclear power in India, is a member of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. Frank von Hippel, nuclear physicist, is professor of public and international affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School. He's co-chair of the International Panel on Fissile Materials and a member of the program in science and global security. Some of you may have seen Frank's several appearances on TV after the Fukushima disaster. And you may have seen his op-ed in the New York Times this morning. Eric's going to start by giving some perspective on the earthquake and tsunami that struck Japan and that triggered the nuclear crisis. Alex will briefly summarize the progression of events at the Fukushima site. Ramana will reflect on what lessons regarding nuclear safety may be learned. And finally, Frank will focus on how to make existing reactors, and especially existing reactors in the United States, safer. The presentations will be relatively brief, and the hope is to leave ample time for questions. So, Eric?
Can we get the mic adjusted correctly to start with?
Thank you, Hal. Well, earthquakes are bound to happen, and they're associated, of course, with plate tectonics. The largest ones are so-called subduction zone earthquakes, where relatively thin and young ocean plates slip and dip under the thicker and denser continental plates. These so-called thrust fault earthquakes occur offshore, and they often produce sudden up and down motion of the ocean floor, generating large tsunami waves, which is of course what happened in Japan. The dominant fraction of the total energy released over some period of time, say a century, on the globe occurs in or near what's called a ring of fire, basically the boundary of the Pacific plate. Included in these are last year's large earthquake in Chile, magnitude 9, the earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand, magnitude 6.5, and the March 11 Japan quake off the coast of Japan, a magnitude 9. Together with the 1964 Alaska earthquake and an earlier earthquake in Chile in 1960, which had a magnitude 9.5, the largest ever recorded, these together account for over half of the total seismic energy released globally. Well, this earthquake was the result of thrust faulting along the plate boundary where the Pacific plate subducts beneath Japan, as shown on the slide. This map also shows here the rate and direction of motion of the Pacific plate relative to the North American and Eurasian plates shown near the Japan Trench. Notice that Japan is located actually at the intersection of 4 major tectonic plates: the North American plate, the Eurasian plate, the Pacific plate, and then in the south, the Philippine plate. As to magnitude scale, I should mention there are 2 scales commonly in use. One, which we've been referring to here, M9, is the moment magnitude scale, which really characterizes the true size of an earthquake in terms of total energy released. It exceeds the Richter magnitude for very large earthquakes. So M9 is a moment magnitude. It's actually proportional to the logarithm of energy released, which is in turn proportional to the length of breakage of fault, the amount of slip that occurs on the fault, and then the rigidity of the rock. So, what are the consequences of earthquakes? Well, the arrows on the side of the slide indicate the kinds of consequences experienced in this earthquake, namely strong ground motion that causes all structures and systems in, say, a nuclear plant to shake violently simultaneously. These motions may, of course, exceed design levels of acceleration or displacement. Tsunami, of course. Dam failures occurred in this case. Major fires following typically the breakage of gas lines, and then aftershocks. In this case, there have been hundreds of aftershocks of magnitude exceeding 6. With regard to ground motion, I should mention that the amplitudes of ground motion, of course, decrease quite rapidly as a function of distance between a site, a structure, and the seismic source. Notably, the decay is much more rapid in regions where the rock is broken and fractured near plate boundaries, and much slower when an earthquake occurs inside a continental plate, because the rock is intact and the motions persist at high amplitudes much longer, which is quite significant from the standpoint of nuclear seismic safety. Well, Japan is, the word tsunami is of course Japanese, and there are early records of tsunamis off the east coast of Japan. The earliest one dates to 869. It apparently was a magnitude 8.3 earthquake, as has been estimated from the depth of sediments in this area. A tsunami a little more than a century ago in 1896 killed 22,000 people. And the 1960 9.5 earthquake in Chile actually produced a tsunami that killed hundreds in Japan as well as in Hawaii. Okay, so this earthquake occurred 130 kilometers, about 80 miles east of Sendai, Japan, island of Honshu, and 230 miles northeast of Tokyo. The length of fault slip was 500 kilometers. The fault breaks at about 3 kilometers per second, so we're talking about a duration of as much as 3 minutes of fairly strong shaking. The measured peak ground acceleration near Fukushima was about 60% of the acceleration of gravity. Apparently, the reactor number 1, the oldest at Fukushima Daiichi plant, had an original design peak ground acceleration of 0.37 g and has been recently recertified for a higher level of acceleration of 0.62. So the shaking actually approached and was very nearly equal to the design peak acceleration. My last slide is just an indication of the kinds of factors that go into risk assessment, seismic risk assessment for any kind of structure, including a nuclear plant. So we think in terms of needing an earthquake hazard model, an exposure model, and a vulnerability model. And you can see some of the factors that go into these 3 boxes that lead to an assessment of an existing facility. Then, of course, as engineers and scientists, we're interested in reducing the risk in risk management, which may involve insurance and reinsurance, varying, changing, upgrading safety standards, determining what level of risk is supposed to be acceptable, the cost and effectiveness of mitigation measures, and finally, the quality of inspection and maintenance. Enough said. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. I guess we take questions at the end. Well, as Hal mentioned, I will try and summarize in the next few minutes, very briefly, really, the main events of this accident, and which is, of course, still unfolding and whose consequences we cannot really fully anticipate at this point. But before I kind of move on, let me just very briefly show the following chart. What you see is nuclear power in the world. We have been operating roughly 400 nuclear reactors for about 30 years, and if you add those up, that gives you roughly 12,000 reactor years of experience. Now on this chart, 3 Mile Island, which happened in 1979, 3 Mile Island happened a very long time ago, so to speak, in the very early ages or stages of nuclear energy use. And even Chernobyl seems to be rather far away, and as you know, we will commemorate the 25th anniversary in about 4 weeks. We have really produced most of the nuclear electricity since Chernobyl. And I guess that's one of the reasons why kind of nuclear optimists, I guess, have taken this chart really as evidence for the viability of a global nuclear renaissance. We assume that reactor safety had matured, operators were better trained, and really that catastrophic accidents were simply not going to happen again. Unfortunately, now we have another data point. And I guess the future of nuclear power looks much more uncertain today than it did 2 weeks ago. Now, turning to Japan, as Eric mentioned, on March 11, a magnitude 9 earthquake struck in the Pacific about 130 kilometers off the coast of Japan. And as you can see on this map, Japan has about 50 nuclear reactors located at 17 different sites along the coast. Those closest to the epicenter of the earthquake, including the units of Fukushima, immediately shut down after detecting the earthquake. And but you know the rest of the story. About an hour later, the tsunami arrived at the Fukushima plant, and as you can see on this picture, which I guess taken during better days of the site, there's a lot of infrastructure on the site located outside, assuming that a tsunami would not actually cross the seawall, which you can also see in this picture. Now, the tsunami has taken out most of this equipment, and the site immediately lost off-site power. It then also lost on-site power when the diesel generators that were of course, available failed when they were flooded, and I think they also were losing the fuel for these diesel generators. And Ramana will kind of briefly talk about common mode failures. You have 8 of those diesel generators. It really doesn't help you at all at this point. For a few hours then, the reactor at the site had battery backup power, but eventually those were drained. And after a few hours, around midnight, between March 11 and March 12, the site really faced a complete power loss, station blackout, which is one of the worst nightmares of a nuclear operator. I should also mention very briefly, see the 6 numbers here. Only 3 reactors were running at the time of the earthquake. Units 1, 2, and 3. 4, 5, and 6 were shut down for maintenance and refueling. So really most of what we're seeing today is related to these units 1, 2, and 3, but there's another one, unit 4 in the foreground, which was defueled, but which has serious problems with cooling of the spent fuel in the pools, and I will say a word about those too. About the reactor design, here you see a view of the reactor. It's an old US design, very similar to those that are still operating in this country and also elsewhere. In the center, I guess you can see it. You can see the so-called reactor vessel, this brown structure, and inside this vessel is the so-called reactor core with the fuel. Below that vessel, you see this donut-shaped structure, which is a pool that plays an important role for safety of this particular design, and you will see it in a minute again. And you can also see at the top of the reactor an orange crane, and below that crane is a pool for spent fuel. That's a convenient, but we would now say a questionable design choice to have your spent fuel sitting in the attic of the reactor, so to say. And I think Frank will discuss this aspect in a minute. Okay, now very briefly, what happened over and it's still happening after the accident. As I said, the reactor, at some point, the site lost a complete power, station blackout. At that point, none of the pumps were working. Although there was one remaining emergency pump that stopped working at that point when the batteries were drained. And there's one last strategy that you can use to really cool the core, which is to open a steam relief valve, and you see it here indicated with this red arrow, and discharge the steam from the reactor vessel in this donut-shaped pool at the bottom. And that works for a while, but not forever. Obviously, the water level in the core will then drop, exposing the core, and at high temperatures, the fuel cladding, which kind of encapsulates the fuel, oxidizes, picks up oxygen, and releases hydrogen in the process. And you may have heard about hydrogen. We'll get to that in a minute. Ultimately, also, the fuel will melt or break and release the radioactivity. More importantly, you can do this for a while, but you are heating the water in this pool at the bottom. And at some point, it just starts boiling and will not be able to actually capture the steam that you are trying to run through this pool. And at that point, you essentially just push the steam into this light bulb-shaped containment, and which raises the pressure in this containment. The operators, of course, were aware of this and had to kind of take a very difficult decision and decided to vent and depressurize this containment, releasing hydrogen and radioactive material into the secondary containment, the roof, so to speak. Of course, they weren't sure, or they hoped there was no hydrogen or radioactivity in that steam, but of course there was, and you've seen the pictures, essentially the hydrogen explosion and the radioactivity release. Here's a picture from the second day of the accident, and you see two of the reactors already had the explosion, and in the meantime there's a third one that also exploded. Now, very briefly, one last slide with here the graphics. There's a second type, and really a totally independent type of accident that is also unfolding, which is related to the spent fuel pools. One of the reactors in particular, Unit 4, which actually wasn't operating at the time, had fresh spent fuel sitting in this pool in the attic. And since there was no cooling available, the water level is falling and still falling, and probably also releasing radioactivity into the environment. So that's essentially my very brief summary, and I omitted many details, but we may discuss them in the Q&A. The question then becomes what lessons can be learned, and my colleagues, M.V. Ramana and Frank von Hibbel, will walk you through some of those. Before I close, I have one last slide, at least, showing you one of the issues that I see. What you see here is the global fleet of nuclear power reactors. Today we have, subtracted the four in Japan, now 438 reactors in 30 countries. And as you can see here too, most of them, of course, concentrated in a number, on a few numbers of countries. About 50% of all reactors are in the United States, France, and Japan. Now, as you may know, very few reactors have come online over the past 2 decades, really. And as a result, the existing fleet of reactors is aging. And that's a problem that's particularly acute and true for the US. And I'm not sure if you can see this. I guess you can. About 40% of the US reactors are now reaching the original end of their lives. We have been really counting on life extensions for these reactors, adding another 20 or even 40 years to keep them running and to mitigate carbon emissions. And that's kind of one of the most relevant outcomes, I predict, of the Fukushima accidents. It will really fundamentally affect the trajectory of life extensions, or the discussions about life extensions in the United States, in Europe. It's actually already happening. You may have seen that Germany shut down 7 of its reactors basically immediately after the accident. And it will possibly also affect really the discussion about safety more broadly, which I hope in the longer term could actually be a good thing. But my colleague M.V. Ramana will tell you more about the safety issues. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. First, I sort of want to start by saying there is practically an infinite amount of information out there. News is coming all the time, and it's almost impossible to keep track of everything. And therefore, what I will be saying here, and it's very likely that we are going to find out lots of new details in the coming weeks and months about what happened. So what I'm going to have to say here is necessarily preliminary and somewhat tentative. The possibility of catastrophic accidents or major accidents at nuclear reactors is something that has been recognized from the very beginning. And so nuclear engineers and designers have thought about the question of how to deal with this and how to sort of mitigate an accident should one occur, how to reduce the chances of accidents occurring in the first place, and how to probably build designs which don't have the possibilities of accidents. So sort of grapple with all these questions. And for the most part, what has happened is that they have settled on something which often is called defense in depth. And the idea is to have multiple protective systems with much redundancy so that if one fails, there are still other things to take play the same role. And that many have to fail before a radioactive release occurs. This idea of defense in depth is not unique to the nuclear industry, though it's sort of, because of the potential for catastrophic accidents, it's sort of the most, it's the place where it plays a huge role. And the idea has been sort of encapsulated in this little quote from a popular nuclear energy textbook by David Bodansky that I sort of put, which is basically that everything has to go wrong. So for example, if you think about what happens to the radioactivity contained inside a fuel element, a fuel rod, which is inside the nuclear reactor, once you load a reactor with nuclear fuel, there are fission reactions happening inside. These fission reactions produce various radioactive products, which are often called fission products. And the primary concern is that this doesn't escape out into the environment. So there are sort of at least 3 levels of protection. The first is that the fuel is enclosed in something called a cladding, which is usually a metal sort of ring that sort of goes around it. And this is the thing that's made of zirconium that Alex talked about, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then these fuel rods are kept inside the pressure vessel that Alex showed, and that's a thick metal wall. It's not something that's going to break easily and can withstand a high pressure. And finally, the whole thing is kept under one or more containment buildings, which are also have to fail for this radioactivity to escape. So how was the radioactivity released in this case? As Alex mentioned, there was a sort of series of failures of different cooling modes. First, the external power was lost. Then the diesel generators failed, and then the internal cooling system sort of failed, and so on. And so when these serial failures sort of occurred, essentially when the reactor lost cooling, the temperature of the fuel starts increasing. The temperature increases basically because these fission products still keep producing heat. And this heat has to be somehow taken out. And since that couldn't be done, the temperature of the fuel rod starts increasing. At some point, the cladding fades. In other words, it starts allowing all the gaseous radionuclides, the volatile radionuclides, to escape into the reactor vessel and mix with the steam there. Further, the zirconium, which is the material that's used in the cladding, interacted with the steam to produce hydrogen. And this hydrogen also escaped into the reactor vessel. And there are sort of possibly, those direct venting that Alex mentioned. Some have also raised the possibility that under these high pressure conditions, there may have been leaks. And apparently there were tests in the 1970s in US boiling water reactors where they have seen some such cases of leaks. And this could again be a case through which hydrogen sort of escaped. And once the hydrogen comes in contact with air, there's a possibility of it exploding, and that's what happened. So coming back to sort of drive home the point, how did the multiple cooling systems fail? And essentially what happened was what we call a common cause failure. The same cause basically took out almost all of them. Rather than these failures being independent failures, in which case you have a small probability of each failure, you multiply those probabilities, you get a small, very, very small probability. Instead, what happened was all of them sort of failed because of the same cause. So this was the cause of the loss of off-site power to the reactor. the early reports were that the off-site power was lost when the earthquake struck, but since then most sort of news items seem to suggest that it's actually the tsunami which caused that. The oil tanks were washed away. That means that there was no replacement fuel for the diesel generators. The switchyard where the electric connections were sort of kept was flooded, so it was in the basement, and so you couldn't sort of even have, even if you could get some replacement generators into there, you could not sort of connect it to the systems, to the electrical systems. And it's also probable that the water inlets from the ocean, that the ocean is the ultimate place where all the heat has to go out. That's the ultimate heat sink. They may also have been damaged by the tsunami. At least from the pictures, it doesn't look like they are in great shape. So we don't know whether there was sort of that external heat sink that is available. It's very hard in general for those people who sort of done probabilistic risk assessments, the methods that they use to sort of try to estimate risk of accidents, major accidents. It's very hard to model these kind of failures. There are sort of general problems with probabilistic risk assessments in that unless you know what all pathways an accident can take, unless you have a complete list, you cannot sort of estimate the total probability. If you've forgotten about one possibility, then that doesn't get incorporated in your calculation. And this is a problem that, it's an incompleteness problem. It's hard to ever be convinced of that. The one other point I would like to make is that common cause failures are not limited to tsunamis. The tsunami was a sufficient condition, not a necessary condition. We've seen similar common cause failures in other kinds of reactors, in other reactor accidents. Fires are a very common place where this happens. Earthquakes, again, can also cause different failures at the same time. The second thing is that the tsunami in this case was an external event. If you look at the two other major catastrophic nuclear accidents we've seen, 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, they were triggered purely by internal events. And so it's important to remember. It's also important to remember that these different accidents occurred in different reactor designs. It's not as though just this Fukushima design was a bad one and every other design is sort of safe. What else can we learn from these failures? Multiple safety systems, obviously it's common sense that it's better to have multiple safety systems and they are usually good. But sometimes they do lead to unexpected consequences because they do interact with each other. So in this case, this is not my insight. This is something which was first suggested by Charles Perrow, a sociologist in Yale, who looked at the 3 Mile Island accident. And what he pointed out was that sometimes these complex systems start interacting with each other, the subsystems. And in this case, what we saw was that the hydrogen which was released by the interaction of the cladding, which is one level of safety protection, the interaction of that with steam went into the reactor, exploded, and in one case there is some reports that it damaged the containment. It also damaged some of the spent fuel pools. So you can see one of those cases where multiple levels of safety have these unexpected consequences. So the implication is that redundancy might have unexpected consequences and might sort of negatively affect safety. This is again not my original insight, but this is just an illustration of things which people have seen in other cases. Most prominently, Scott Sagan is somebody who sort of looked at this in many cases, in the case of nuclear weapons accidents and in a variety of other settings. Another thing which most people sort of took away as a lesson by reading the accounts of this, including the New York Times, is that it's a really stupid idea to keep the switchyard in the basement. And that seems like, yes, it does seem like a stupid idea now, but it is only now that we realize that. It's only in hindsight. And so the design error, and I put error in quotes, because I think there's also another thing which a lot of people forget, is that whoever the designer is, if you pull him or her up and ask him, why did you keep it there, he or she probably had a very good reason to do that. It could have been very well safety reasons because it may be less vulnerable to fire or some other hazard. It could also be other priorities, the fact that you don't want to keep it away from the reactor and because then you expose it to other kind of vulnerabilities, or it could be just having it in a compact and cost-cutting sort of reasons. So it's important to remember that it may not be possible to address simultaneously all these different vulnerabilities, and certainly not all possible priorities. So this is now the big question, and I think everybody is going to have sort of a different answer. So this is just my take on this. I think that what this implies for the future of nuclear power is that Accidents are going to be inevitable in these kind of reactors, even if they are low frequency events. So the question is, what implications does it have in terms of nuclear policy? In terms of public opinion, this is certainly going to affect it. Right? Imagine, you are going to have a reactor sited within, 50 miles. This is what the US NRC said to US citizens in Japan: if you're within 50 miles of the reactor, then please leave. And if that's the case, the message they're going to be giving there, the same thing might have to be sort of something that the public will be thinking about here. The second is that the technical community, there's a lot of discussion about whether other designs, newer designs, might actually have dealt with this problem, and this is something which is too early to say. But I would say that one of the lessons we've learned about nuclear power in general in the last few decades is that it's been very difficult to build new reactor designs. The electrical utilities are much more comfortable with the existing designs. They know how to operate them. They know all the problems with it, the pluses of it. So it's been very difficult to find new designs to be constructed. The last point to remember is that this was a case where there were multiple reactors at the same site. And what we saw was that accidents at one reactor could impact other reactors, spent fuel pools, and also emergency operations. Because the radiation levels were so high in front of one unit, workers could not go to other units to sort of do filling and so on and so forth. So the question is whether this is going to impact future construction of multiple reactors at the same site. There are a lot of advantages to doing that. These are economic advantages, logistic advantages, advantages because it's very difficult to get sites for nuclear reactors. But this is going to be the negative impact of that. Lastly, I want to come back to the question of sort of advanced reactors. So a lot of advanced reactors, this is a picture of the French EPR, the Arriva's EPR reactors, not French, it's French and German, I think. And they claim that they have a much safer system, and they estimate a core damage frequency, which is about an order of factor of 100 lower. There are two questions to ask here. The first question is, can we believe that figure that they sort of quote? And that's an open question. I leave it open. But the second is that what Arriva had to do in order to build this supposedly safer reactor is make it much more expensive. And as a result, we saw this case of when they tried to sell this reactor to the UAE, and they lost the bid to the Koreans, who underbid them by something like $20 billion. And so if you're going to have a safer reactor, it's going to be more expensive. Nuclear power already has a challenge of economics before it. How is this going to affect it? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk get local here. This is distribution of the ages of the U.S. reactors. You see that they were mostly built before 1990. There's still one from the 1970s that's under construction. There was this pause. It was 1 year in this period when in 1979, which was the year of 3 Mile Island, when everything was put on halt. But we are talking about 104 reactors. In the first group of reactors in 1969 was Oyster Creek, which is about 50 miles from here, which is the twin reactor to the oldest reactor at Fukushima. It's just been relicensed for another 20 years because it reached the 40-year point. I think that it's unlikely. You see that the power construction stopped here. Part of the reason was costs. The reactors turned out to be more costly, especially after 3 Mile Island. And they took longer to construct them because they're very capital intensive. That meant a lot of extra interest charges on top of that. And at this point, especially with the sort of cheap natural gas, which is all of a sudden available in this country, it seems very unlikely that there will be many nuclear reactors built. the Energy Information Administration, which is the official government projector of these things, believes that there will be 5 units built in the next 25 years. And that's just because of massive government subsidies to try to start up the nuclear industry again. So the main issue is going to be these old plants, and can we make them safer? I'm now just going to summarize sort of the first half of this very long op-ed that I published this morning. A major issue there is do we have the regulatory commission that we need to upgrade, to try to improve the safety of these aging cohorts of plants? Because it's 3 Mile Island was so long ago, I think the political attention in Washington and government sort of has turned to other things, and safety was not a major priority. The current chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was nominated by Senator Reid. He was one of his staff members because he wanted to stop Yakima, the repository in Nevada. That was Senator Reid's priority, and that is actually right now there's a stalemate on the commission with a vote of 2-2 and one commissioner recusing about whether in fact to stop that licensing process. The previous chairman, appointed by President Bush, his major qualification was that he was married to to President Bush's secretary when he was governor of Texas. So we need to I don't want to say bad things about the commissions. But I just want to say that the pressure on them has not been to focus on safety. That's not why they've been appointed. And in fact, the industry has this phenomenon called, I think, regulatory capture, where if the public and Congress is not aroused about an issue, the industry tends to take over, and they do that by vetting appointments. The appointments are not made if they're opposed by the industry. And the industry can lobby to cut back the budget of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and limit what they can do, and they have. So I'm just going to briefly talk about three ideas I still think are good, which the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has rejected over the last 30 years. Before I do, but I should mention that the reactors in Fukushima and our Oyster Creek reactor here, it was recommended by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission staff it was actually just before it became the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it was at that time inside the Atomic Energy Commission. It was recommended that no more of these reactors be licensed in 1972. But already a number had been licensed, including the Oyster Creek reactor, and the person who was the equivalent of the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission responded that this would mean the end of nuclear power. If we basically say these reactors that we've already licensed are not safe, then it'll mean the end of nuclear power. We can't do this. It's more than I can stand to think about it. And so we went down this track. Now the first good idea here is something which became very relevant in Fukushima. Alex mentioned that the containment overpressure. And if the containment overpressures, you're going to have to release gases, and they carry radioactivity. Well, the proposal, which was actually made before 3 Mile Island, in 1977 by a group of nuclear engineers at UCLA, was, well, if it fails, we should have at least filter the gases before they're released. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission didn't think that it really was necessary. The second idea related to the fact what was happening in U.S. spent fuel pools. Because, well, originally the pools were designed to hold only 5 years worth of spent fuel discharges. And after 5 years, it was expected that the fuel would be shipped someplace else. Originally, it was to a reprocessing plant, and then later to Yakima. But the U.S. abandoned nuclear fuel reprocessing, and then the Yakima, which was supposed to, required by Congress to be open to take the spent fuel in 1998, didn't materialize. And so the utilities, originally on the left side here, you see the original racking in the spent fuel in the pools. There is an open racking system with quite a bit of openings from the side. But then, with no place for the fuel to go, they added what we call dense rack the pools. They basically put the fuel as densely into the reactors, into the pools as it is in the reactors. And so then there was a concern that, well, we don't want it to go critical, and so they put each fuel assembly in a box with neutron poisons in the partitions between the fuel assemblies, so the neutron absorbers, so that a chain reaction couldn't be sustained. But this made if you lose water, you sort of basically negated any kind of possibility of air cooling, which there was some possibility for in the original design. So it was proposed that this was dangerous. Repeatedly in reports to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission from its national laboratories, a group of us picked it up a few years ago, and then he basically wrote a review article about this problem, and we were roundly attacked by the industry and by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission said that it had a new report analysis of this situation, which said that the situation was much less, that these old reports that had been done for it and been published were overly conservative, and that the situation wasn't so bad. But they couldn't show us the report because it was secret and it might give terrorist ideas, which was somewhat of a self-contradictory statement. And it turned out later on that there was no such report. So this is, where would it go if you took it out of the pools? Well, this is in fact, now the pools are full. It has to go someplace. It can't go off-site. And this is so what's happening now is the oldest spent fuel in the pools is being put into dry air-cooled casks. And so the issue really was, do you have 25 years of fuel in the spent fuel pool, or do you have 5 years? And the only issue is between those is do you buy more casks? And that was the objection, really. There was about $7 billion worth of casks would have had to have been bought. So finally, the third idea. Now here's a map of New Jersey, and you can see where reactors are. And I've just, for your convenience, I've pointed out where we are. And you see, there's reactors in every direction. And the sizes of the circles this inner circles are 10 miles in radius, and the outer circles are 50 miles in radius. The 10-mile radius is the emergency planning zone. And people in that area, among other things, would be evacuated if necessary, but also would be provided potassium iodide, which has become famous to protect people's thyroids from the radioactive iodine if it was released. But as we've seen in Japan, and it was argued, and even Congress passed a law that it should be available out to 20 miles. We're now handing out in Tokyo, our embassy is presumably with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's advice, handing out potassium iodide to people 140 miles away from Fukushima. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has fought for 30 years against doing this. I mean, against going beyond the 10-mile limit. And in fact, even after Congress passed the law, has blocked going to 20 miles because the concern that people might get alarmed by saying, here's your potassium iodide in case there's a reactor accident. What, you mean there could be a reactor accident? So that's I think that's it. Yeah, thank you. So we tried to go through this quickly so there would be time left for your questions. And so we
have about half an hour for questions, and people should come up to the microphone, these two microphones here. And also, I should announce that there's going to be a public reception in the Schultz dining room right out here after the panel discussion is over. So, direct questions either to the whole panel or to specific folks.
I read in only one place that the operators of the plant did not follow the instructions from General Electric, which would have had seawater flood much earlier than it did. First, if you know whether this is true, and second, would it have made any difference?
I mean, it's actually, it may be true, I don't know for a fact, but actually the use of seawater is now leading to a problem, which it was mentioned in the New York Times this morning, that if you keep putting seawater into the pressure, into the reactor and keep boiling off steam, what you have left is salt. And that's, a lot of people worry about the implications of that.
You mentioned that we have old reactors getting to the end of their lifetime, and we may or may not want to relicense them. But if we don't, then we probably have to decommission them. And I'd be interested in hearing if we know how to do that, and we have an idea of cost.
I think actually it has been done already, and it's being done. So we do know it's very expensive. It's in the $1 billion range. To build a new reactor today is like in the $5 billion range. So it's not more costly than building it in the first place, but it is very expensive.
And eventually, even with life extensions, of course, eventually we will have to decommission every single reactor, either now or in 20 or 40 years.
I have two related questions on public policy. The first is there any place in this process for citizen input, especially on those reactors that have gone through their life cycle and are now being relicensed? I raise that because the question currently in Vermont is whether the state legislature has any right to be placed into the process and either agree or deny licensing. The second is, we hear the concept of economic cost all the time. Isn't one of the fundamental policy problems that if you're going to have nuclear power, if you're using the model of the public-private sector working together, you're assuming a profit motive. And as we've seen, as some of the issues raised in Japan, are that some of the design features were created in order to cut costs and maximize profit. And this profit issue also is involved in the relicensing. It's clear that the major motivation for the industry to relicense is that having paid off the capital cost, you now are running at a higher profit level. So the question that I have is, would it not, if we're going to commit to nuclear, isn't it important to consider the prospect that the profit motive should be removed and the public-private should be changed so that for nuclear power, the cost is always secondary to the safety, and if that can only be done by the government, then so be it. And when a plant reaches its natural lifespan, shouldn't the location, the state in which it's in, have a right to decide whether they wish to have it there relicensed?
Let me take a crack at the second question on the question of public-private distribution.
If you move your mic just a little closer.
Yeah. Is this better? Okay. So this is the problem of safety is sort of twofold. One is that I think it cuts across whether it's a private or a public sector enterprise. So I'm very familiar with the situation in India, and I won't vouch for their safety any more than I would vouch for reactors here. And there they are run by a government public sector thing. They don't have to show a profit at the end of the year. They can just run on losses forever. And it's just taxpayer money. The second is, I think you also have to come back to it sort of relates to the earlier question that you asked. Who gets to decide that a certain thing is safe, right? And in the systems everywhere, it's actually these nuclear engineers who are sort of trained to be doing all these calculations and so on and so forth. And within that community, if you, again, I'm sort of going to quote from certain specific examples in Japan, in India, and so on, is that there is a general belief that these kind of accidents are very, very unlikely, right? And at some point, they just kind of persuade themselves it's not going to happen. Certain things just don't happen. And this is, again, not restricted to the nuclear industry. If you looked at NASA and the Challenger accident, this is exactly what they saw there. That they kind of convinced themselves that certain things are not going to happen, and it sort of happened. So that's, I think, a general problem. On Vermont, actually.
Maybe on the citizen involvement, the ultimate arbiter on this is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But the state can make it very difficult. I mean, they can say, we're not going to give you a license for your water or something like that. And I mean, they have certain ways indirectly that they can influence it. There is a public hearing process for this relicensing today, and citizens groups can intervene. Also, states can bring issues to for example, with the spent fuel pool, a group of states attorney generals raised the issue of this dense packing of the spent fuel pools with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission then still has a decision power on whether to do anything about it.
I had a couple of thoughts and follow-up. In general, in risk assessment, a key issue is really who benefits and who suffers the consequences. And for many kinds of infrastructure systems, whether it's dams or nuclear facilities, these are different people. And it's really a key question as to the profit motive, how that ought to be figured in. And related also is the question of intended operational life of a facility. We have numerous infrastructure systems, bridges, dams that simply remain. They probably deteriorate, and we have no process actually of certifying them. We do, fortunately, for the nuclear industry, but it's a bigger problem even.
If I can, Mike, a final quick comment on safety and design choices, just as I kind of throw this in. After 9/11, when we thought about reactor safety, of course, many assumed that the next accident, especially in this country, would be an airliner crashing into a nuclear power plant. And of course, the existing designs are not hardened enough to take that such a crash. And over the last few years, there was a new paradigm emerging that maybe we should build nuclear reactors, smaller units, and build them underground, because that somehow would remove that risk from the equation. Now we are in a different, 2 weeks ago we had an earthquake, and building underground may not help you. It may actually be worse in terms of the seismic coupling. So there's always a trade-off, and you may not, it's really what Ramana also mentioned. I mean, there are certain risk and accident scenarios that you simply do not take into account when you make design choices.
I was wondering, earlier this week, I heard an announcement from China that they decided to freeze construction on this huge growth in reactor construction that they're planning. And as the Obama administration tries to build momentum into this nuclear renaissance, and remember the implications from the 3 Mile Island scare, I wonder what the ripple effects globally in terms of the future of civilian nuclear energy you see from this, not so much on a technical reactor construction scale, but on kind of the bigger picture.
Well, I think, I mean, I mentioned Germany in my talk briefly. I think this is going to be a game changer, at least in the German debate, definitely. China, I suspect, will at some point go back to its original plans. For the US, and I think Frank mentioned one report, and I would quote another one. There was a National Academy study last year on America's energy future, and they had very strong recommendations on different areas. And one of them on nuclear was basically we have 1 decade, until 2020, to build a handful of reactors. They were talking about 5 to 10 to basically demonstrate the economics of nuclear, especially in the United States. And essentially was saying if you cannot do this, I mean, if either the economics turn out to be negative and non-competitive, or you simply don't build these plants, they may come too late to actually help mitigating climate change. So that's, I think, the dilemma right now. Building 1 or 2 plants won't give you the answer you want. And it might be very hard to, or maybe impossible to build, 10 power plants by 2020, given the new circumstances.
On China, very briefly, I think what we might see there is a slowdown. It's not going to be this thing. And this is because there has been conflict within the Chinese decision-making system about the pace at which they are building reactors. And many people have been concerned that they just don't have enough regulators and safety professionals and so on, and even trained nuclear operators to be running these plants at the rate at which they're sort of building them. So I think Fukushima just provided the opportunity for the upper levels to just kind of use this point to sort of intervene in that debate.
Well, with regard to China also, certainly the fact that this 3rd nuclear accident was earthquake-related will ring majorly a bell in China, because the Tanshan earthquake, 1976, 650,000 people were killed, the city destroyed. Likewise, 2 years ago, Sichuan, 100,000 people. So the Chinese are very aware of the intraplate earthquake problem covering all of China.
Although natural gas isn't free without its own risks. Although natural gas isn't free without its own risks. We lost a community in California a year ago from a natural gas explosion. And I believe that's also subject to potential earthquake damage. But that's not my question. It would appear from this accident, one of the problems was the hydrogen release from zirconium oxidation. And I believe that was also a problem at 3 Mile Island. Now, in one of the slides, there was a proposed solution to venting, and it looked like that advanced design had that. But it would appear that the 3 modes of failure that provided a radiation risk, which are the primary risk, all the 50-mile things are radiation risk, not plant loss risks. It would appear there were 4 possible failure modes that weren't fully dealt with. One was the release of hydrogen. A second was whether the structure was capable of containing a melted core. The third was the decision process in saying, let's stop here and melt the core and be done with it. The fourth was the spent fuel pools, which are using water to contain their radiation, and when they lose the water, there's really no containment. While Indian Point has a thin shell concrete dome, which probably would have failed under the hydrogen explosion also, these buildings had the containment structure was thin sheet steel, was nothing. So the question I have is, given that there's some it appears to be relatively well known from the slides really contemplated with resolution, why haven't these sort of failure modes been dealt with? As a sidebar, in considering that, you would have to always assume that you would have some period where you cannot get personnel to a plant, you cannot operate a plant for communication failure. You could have had a chemical release from something else, like a Bhopal type incident, where you could have had no personnel anywhere near the facility able to access it. So there's a lot of scenarios where no matter what you do, you could be a week without being able to access a facility, which would presumably lead to meltdown and water loss in all aspects. Why haven't these sort of things, where has the political problems been in surfacing these further?
Maybe I'll just, I mean, the regulatory process is very stylized. And this probabilistic risk assessment is basically the Nuclear Regulatory Commission says you've got to prove to us that you've with all the possible combinations of failures, the probability of a combination leading to a meltdown and a failure of containment is below a very low probability. And of course, it's always something that you didn't put into the probabilistic risk assessment.
Shouldn't that even be a default failure mode? I mean, they had no pumps after 8 hours or so. So I don't know what the pumping was because they didn't have any electricity to do anything. So I don't think they actually were putting any water in anywhere for a couple of days. The default mode should easily have been, I cannot recover this within my failure mode. My contained, controlled failure mode is meltdown, drain the water so I don't have. The hydrogen only comes when the oxidation comes in the presence of water. It doesn't come in the presence of air. There's no nitrogen release, taking the oxygen out of the air. The default mode is drain the thing, let it melt down, let the containing vessel absorb the corium, and you've got no reactor problem. You've got a mess to clean up, but you don't have a radiation exposure to any population areas. The spent fuel, which has no containing vehicle, that seems to be an open, and apparently it's also a known terrorist attack risk, low effort terrorist attack risk. That seems to be a very uncontained problem. But it seems there's a whole decision process involved.
But maybe very briefly, I mean, every reactor design has what is called a design basis accident and certain scenarios which are considered beyond design basis accidents. And so this was a beyond design basis accident. And the current, and I'm not defending, either, this is where we have to draw the line, but that's what it is. And the old reactors in Fukushima and, Oyster Creek, the assumption is you can get back power within a couple of hours. That was in the 1960s. People assumed that's plausible and reasonable. Newer designs try to stretch that amount of time with passive safety mechanisms to, say, 2 or 3 days. Again, you can say that's much better. It would not have helped in the case of Fukushima. So, but at some point, designers and regulators will draw a line and will say we can't do any better than that unless, we explore yet another design which may have other problems. I'm not defending.
I don't know that. But that's students there. Get some questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Sort of looking forward to carbon capture and storage, I see a lot of similarities between nuclear power and spent fuel storage management and CCS technology. And my question to you all is what can we learn from the community engagement strategies with nuclear power and how to sort of lay the foundation for a CCS strategy in the future, and how can we learn from these accidents that have impacted the community so severely to sort of create a better future for carbon capture and storage?
I think the lesson that we've learned from not just reactor accidents but more with nuclear waste siting has been the importance of trying to generate public trust. And that's a very difficult thing to actually get, because it depends on sort of two things. One is transparency, and the other is competence. right? And to some extent, they sort of conflict with each other. Because if you show all your calculations, you find that you actually make some mistakes sometimes, and that's fairly human. And then that sort of reflects badly on your competence. And if you sort of don't show that, then there's a problem. So this is I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. But I think one of the things is to start by recognizing that there may be accidents, and we don't know all about everything, and start from being less sort of talking from a pulpit.
Just a very quick question, Dr. Lamarca. It seemed like you had a pretty good list of tsunamis and earthquakes that have happened recently. And one ought to be able to back check whether the probability risk analysis, probability risk analyses that were done on a reasonable basis given the amount of earthquakes and tsunamis we've seen. Is that being done by someone?
Interesting is that this particular earthquake had a magnitude 9 at a location where no such large earthquake was expected by seismologists and geophysicists in Japan. They expected only maybe a magnitude 8. And therefore, even though they had built up tsunami defenses that were much better than anywhere in the world, they were insufficient for the tsunami generated by this larger earthquake. What's also very interesting is that when we do seismic risk analysis in, for example, the eastern United States, that very frequently earthquakes have occurred recently at unknown faults, or faults that were not considered capable of generating the kind of earthquakes that occurred. This is true in California, the Landers earthquake, and actually many earthquakes. Around Indian Point also there are some, well, probably unknown faults for sure. So that's this difficult to calculate risk, but in terms of seismic at least quite essential, really, in terms of believable risk assessment.
Why don't we take 3 more questions? I think just 3 people off the mics.
Okay. Could you clarify for us, there's been no mention of control rods, and I was under the vague impression that these control rods would slap in and completely quench the reactor. And secondly, how much fuel is in these reactors, like 1 year, 2 year? And thirdly, any estimate, I don't know if it's relevant or not, of the amount of energy that's already been released by these reactors?
Well, quickly about the control rods. As I mentioned, I guess, in the beginning of my talk, when the earthquake happened, the reactors did shut down, so the control rods dropped into the core. All we've been talking about is really decay heat. And the decay heat drops to about, say, 5 or 6% of the original power level. But then it actually takes weeks and months to become, a safe and low power level. So for the next weeks, we'll have to kind of fill back the water into this reactor. The second question was about the number of fuel assemblies.
The amount of fuel in there, 1 year, 2 year.
Yeah, it's refueled. These reactors today are typically the fuel is replaced over a period of about 3 to 5 years.
So there's a lot of energy in there.
Well, yes, but that's not being. It's the radioactivity, the heat from the past fissioning that's really being cooled down. And to give you another, I think this maybe between the reactors, they're requiring at this point the equivalent. They're producing the radioactivity is producing an energy equivalent to maybe 20 tons of water, enough to evaporate about 20 tons of water an hour, which is what we're seeing. Them trying to replace. But when they're operating, it's much more.
Is there any institution which is capable of organising international response when there is a crisis? I think a lot of people, myself included, assume that the IAEA would be able to send something like an international emergency response team into Japan. That doesn't appear to have been the case. As I understand it, they didn't send anybody there on the ground for a few days, and most of the international responses come on an intergovernmental level between the Americans and the Japanese government. I was just wondering if you could comment on the role of the IAEA, and if there isn't an institution which can coordinate international response, whether you think that this crisis may create a case that there should be such an institution.
I can maybe just say something about the budget of the IEA. The IEA has a budget of about $200 million a year. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which focuses primarily, and it focuses about most of that budget on either assisting countries, with getting research reactors or using isotopes for agricultural tracers and things like that. And the other half is on making sure that countries don't misuse the nuclear infrastructure for making nuclear weapons. So there's very little, maybe 10 million of that you could associate with safeties. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a budget of about $500 million a year. I mean, the Vienna Fire Department has a bigger budget than the IAEA does.
I was just wondering, since money comes up often in this discussion, how much does a kilowatt of electricity cost on average for nuclear power versus coal or oil or gas?
Well, as I said, we don't really know. I mean, obviously, the existing plants, it's a sunk cost, and they're essentially very, very inexpensive because the fuel is so inexpensive, and you invested the capital a long time ago. If you build reactors today, it would be much more expensive. It would be difficult to compete against gas and coal without carbon control, carbon taxes, or carbon trade in place. We're talking about something around 10 kilowatts. 10 cents a kilowatt or so. But that's what the National Academy has recommended. Essentially, we don't know, especially not in the US, how much it would cost to actually build new reactors, which is why they thought the US should build a handful by 2020, which may or may not happen.
That's the last question.
Would be great to hear a little bit about the health risks that we're facing in Japan. Do you know, is there a possibility of a big radioactive explosion, or are we looking at the low levels that we've seen thus far? And then for the U.S., is there a policy opportunity to say no nuclear reactors within, say, 50 or 100 miles of fault lines, and then would that dramatically change the safety picture? And if not, is there an experience that we can draw from where we just said this is an energy source that's just too risky, and we're going to abandon that?
Well, in terms of the radioactivity that's been released, the reference, the one reference we have is Chernobyl. And in Chernobyl, there were sort of two major consequences from the radioactive release. One was a very large area was contaminated with long-term 30-year half-life cesium-137 with the result that about 1,000 square miles around the reactor is still not inhabitable, and about 4,000 square miles. People have to watch out for their, they sort of live. You can't grow vegetables in your backyard, for example. They have to live in a somewhat constrained way. The other major consequence was thyroid cancer. There have been about 6,000 so far, yesterday, a German meteorological institute sort of used the measurements that were available of radioactivity in the atmosphere to guess how much was released on a Chernobyl scale. And they came up with about 20 to 50% or so for these two critical isotopes, the radioactive iodine and the cesium. I think most of that, fortunately, was blown to sea. I mean, for quite a while, the prevailing wind was offshore. So I don't expect, unless, something still could go wrong. And the wind hasn't been so reliably offshore lately. But I would hope the consequences would be much less than the Chernobyl consequences. With regard to seismic,
there were more than one reactor involved in this accident. Yeah. At least 3 or 4 accidents, which potentially makes it much more serious.
Yeah. Do you want to say something about this?
Let me repeat. Do you want to say something? Let me repeat that there's going to be a public reception in the Schultz dining room next door here. And thank the panel.